So Canada's government just made a change to a policy, one that they're saying results in hundreds, if not thousands of more dollars in most Canadians' pockets.
That is $1,800 a year in Alberta, $1,200 a year in Manitoba, $1,120 a year in Ontario, $1,500 a year in Saskatchewan, $760 a year in New Brunswick, $820 a year in Nova Scotia, $880 a year in PEI, and $1,190 a year in my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador.
To me, this feels like a slap in the face and amounts to them saying, we think Canadians are stupid and we don't even care if they know it anymore. Now, let me explain what I'm talking about. This week, one of Canada's most controversial policies went through a rebrand. The government thinks that by changing the name of something without changing anything about it, that it will change Canadians' minds. This rebrand is happening to the policy that, in the government's eyes, is most important when it comes to protecting the environment.
Well, I think what we did today was just come out what we do in every year, which is to let people know how much money they'll be getting back. Well, yeah, no, we did change the name of it. It's now the Canada Carbon Rebate. And I think, look, the old name was around for about 8 years. I think this is how people talk. This is something I've been working on myself too. You know, you just talk like people talk, and people associate it with carbon. It is most accurately framed, I think, as a rebate, because indeed that's what it is.
This rebrand is happening within Canada's carbon tax. Now, if you're not familiar with this carbon tax or price on pollution, or even if you are familiar with it, it works a little bit differently than you might think. Now, let me explain some of these details, because once you understand this, everything else is going to make a lot more sense, and you'll understand why this rebranding makes me feel, at least, that, and it might make you feel this way too, like we've just been slapped in the face. This countrywide tax was introduced by the Liberals back in 2019 and is designed as a financial incentive to try to make people and businesses change their behavior by taxing businesses based on the amount of fossil fuels they burn and taxing Canadians on products that burn carbon, including the gas people put in their cars and the natural gas many people use to heat their homes. The money that's collected for this tax is then given back to Canadians and redistributed equally to citizens who have been paying the tax. Now you might be saying, Russell, well, then what's the point of them taking the money away if they're just gonna give it back? Well, the idea is that those who use less fuel pay less tax, but still get the same rebate as someone who burns a lot of fuel, leaving them, the people who have used less fuel, financially ahead in comparison to businesses and citizens who pay more into the tax because they use more fuel. And they recently announced how much Canadians could receive based on their family status as a sort of rebate for this tax that they are paying. You can pause the video here if you want to check it out for your individual province and your individual family makeup, but the maximum here is $1,800 if you're a family of 4 in Alberta, as well as a $2,160 if you're a rural family of 4 in Alberta. But here is where the big problem comes into play that makes this policy so incredibly controversial. And you might have different beliefs based on who you listen to, but I'm here to tell you that both opposite sides are both right and wrong at the same time. Now, I want to show you this clip. It's going to make things a lot more clear. Then let's dive in a little bit deeper. But first, if you haven't already, make sure to check out the link in the description where you can sign up for my free email list. I send out bonus content and sources for all these videos, so hop on there now if you're interested.
People hate the carbon tax because 60% pay more into it than they get back in his phony rebates. So today he announced a costly rebranding of the hated carbon tax.
He proposes to take away the carbon price rebate, the Canada Carbon Rebate from millions of Canadian families across the country. The Canada Carbon Rebate is going to be there to continue to deliver more money to 8 out of 10 Canadian families.
So the Conservatives say that most Canadians are actually worse off because of this program and that they pay more in taxes than they get back in rebates. But on the flip side, the Liberals say the opposite, that most Canadians are better off because they get back more money in rebates than what they pay into the carbon tax. Now, the thing is, and this absolutely blows my mind every time I look at it, is that when they say these things, they're actually citing the exact same document somehow. Let me show you what I'm talking about. This is a report that came out, I believe, in early 2023, and it's done by the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, a neutral third party who does financial analysis on government policy to get to the bottom of how the finances of the program actually work. Now, here is the information that the Liberals seem to focus on. They say, considering only the fiscal impact, we estimate that most households will see a net gain, receiving more in rebates from this carbon tax than the total amount they pay in the federal fuel charge. Now, here's an important word right here. The most important one is fiscal. In this context, what they're saying is that when they're making this statement, they're only looking at the first order effects of this carbon tax, essentially how much people actually see on their receipts in the bills for the things that they pay. Keep that in mind, only when you pay it yourself. Later in the very same report, and this is where the Conservatives get their information, they say we incorporate estimates of the economic impact from the federal fuel charge into our calculation of net cost to provide a more complete picture of the overall impact on Canadian households. This may sound complex, but it really isn't. They say that when the economic impact is combined with the fiscal impact, the net cost increases for all households. Before we were talking about the fiscal impact, which is only the first order, like the things that Canadians are actually paying for directly. But when they take a closer look, they look at the economic impact, which also includes all kinds of other things, like how much you're paying on goods that the business has had to pay into the carbon tax and now has raised the cost of that good for you. That's a sort of second order effect included in economic impact, alongside the impact of this will have with where businesses invest and what they invest in, and the impact of that on wages for Canadians. So while Canadians may receive more money back than they directly pay in, which is what the Liberals often point to, when you consider how this tax increases costs for businesses who then pass along those costs to consumers, the overall impact is that most Canadians pay more than they get back. And I think it's better to look at this second number rather than looking at the first number in a vacuum like the Liberals do to make their policy look like it's actually making Canadians money. But to play devil's advocate here, all in all, you might say, okay, if I have to pay a few $100s a year more, but it means we'll actually reduce our emissions and reach our climate goals, maybe that relatively small cost is worth the result. And I think that that would be an entirely fair thing to think, if there were any proof that that was actually true. Despite the countless policies that have been implemented over the past 8 years, the government is still set to miss essentially all of their emissions targets, and this is coming directly from an audit. Let's take a look at it. Again, this is coming from an independent auditor, the Auditor General of Canada, whose duty it is to be entirely impartial. And this report has a pretty scathing review of the current government's progress on this file, along with previous governments before this government was in power. They say that the federal government is not on track to meet the 2030 target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that they found that the measures most critical for actually reducing emissions have not even been prioritized or even identified. They continue saying, while some progress has been made, we're still extremely concerned about their ability to achieve meaningful progress on this entire file. And following this rebranding announcement, which we haven't even gotten into the most offensive part of all of this in my opinion, and we'll get there in a minute, following this rebrand announcement, the government's House leader was grilled on exactly the details that were included in this scathing report that we just looked at.
And greenhouse gases are coming down. There was a report issued in December by the Environment Department that shows that we're making great progress in the fight against greenhouse
With all due
gases.
respect, that same Auditor General's report at the end of November, at the beginning of November rather, said that you were not on track to meet your climate targets at that point.
Yeah, well, the Environment Department begs to differ, and we are on track to reduce by 30% by 2030.
So he says actually the Auditor General, this neutral third party, is wrong, and the report that was written by our government is the one that you should actually believe. Now, this is the report, I'm looking at it right now, that he was mentioning, but nowhere does it actually say Canada is on track to hit the emissions reduction goals it set out. The report just reads a list of all the new and exciting goals, strategies, and assessments that the government has initiated, alongside the hundreds of millions of dollars of spending they've committed, with no actual accountability for hitting these goals and no indication that we're on track to hit them or even get anywhere close. So when I look at the two reports, I tend to believe the report from the neutral third party, Auditor General, a hell of a lot more than I do the report put together by the government about the government. Especially given the head honcho of the department that wrote this report, and that's none other than Stephen Guilbeault, pictured here, who you should know about if you don't already. For decades, he was a Greenpeace activist, even scaling the CN Tower and waving a banner which accused Canada and George Bush of being climate killers. Now, this picture is from the resulting arrest from that stunt. He's been demonized largely by many Canadians for being incredibly anti-car, regularly flaunting that he's never owned one. Personally, I think that's something that tends to say more about the era he grew up in and his current wealth levels than anything else. For most people, starting a family in a major Canadian city, essentially the only place where it's feasible to not own a car, is out of reach given the insane cost of living relative to wages and the housing crisis going on. Most people are forced to move to a suburb or a more rural area where cars are absolutely a necessity. But all of that is beside the point, because time and time again, I get the personal feeling like the government is spitting in my face and in the faces of all Canadian citizens. Now, the reason I feel like this is because it seems like branding and optics is more important to the government than actually doing anything and paying lip service to issues so that uninformed voters will believe them because they don't have the time or energy to look more deeply into these things. Talking about Environmental Minister Guilbeault, this article says that Trudeau's government has frequently used him and his environmental credibility, despite it not being his official portfolio until recently. Even as Heritage Minister, he came out and did a bunch of pre-election appearances to raise funds and to respond to questions in the House of Commons about the environment, even when it wasn't his file. It seems to me that they thought, and this is just speculation, but it looks like they thought, we want to make Canadians believe that we're serious about the environment, so let's get a person with a history of extreme climate demonstrations to show just how serious we are about this, even though we haven't been able to hit any of our emissions reduction goals, and even now have no real reason to believe that we'll ever be able to hit them in the future. Another example of this optics over substance issue I have happened just a few months ago, where a GST and HST rebate that had been scheduled over a year prior was last minute changed to the grocery rebate, as many Canadians were concerned about the rising cost of putting food on the table. Now again, this seems to me like they just picked the boogeyman of the day and thought, what's the lowest effort, highest visibility thing that we can do to try to make people believe that we're helping them? Oh, we can change the name for this pre-existing thing so that it seems like it's targeting what Canadians are worried about right now. It just feels icky. And that extends directly to this rebranding that we've been talking about. I think it's all about optics and what they think will make them look good to voters. The government's been so concerned that people didn't even realize that they were getting carbon tax rebates because they were called climate action incentive payments before. So it seems they thought, we're not getting credit for this money that's going into people's accounts, so we need to rebrand it and make sure that they know that they're getting this money. The added benefit of now calling it a rebate for the government is that they can accuse anyone who wants to change this policy of wanting to take away the rebates that you're currently getting and take away extra money from Canadians, conveniently leaving out that in reality, when all the costs are considered, Canadians end up paying more, like we talked about earlier. I mean, just a couple of days ago, Canada's Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, said that she was working hard on making sure that this rebate shows up in the same way across every bank account, with essentially Canada carbon rebate in bold, so that Canadians, who it seems like she thinks are too stupid to know what this payment is otherwise, will give her and her government credit for giving them money. I mean, look at where the emphasis in this interview is. Is it about explaining to Canadians the intricacies of how the program works, or is it focused on something else?
I think that's why we got to get out there and make sure that people understand, first of all, that this is cold hard cash that you're getting in your pockets. That 8 out of 10 families are doing better as a result. So we got to make sure that we're putting out there what is an actual fact, right? And so calling something, I know this is simple, calling something a slightly different name than it was before, but it is a more accurate name. And we want people to understand that what we are trying to do here puts Canada in a very good place competitively. It'll also help us lower emissions, which we, frankly, as an energy leader in the world, have to do.
In my eyes, this amounts to, look, we're giving you money, but don't look behind the curtain. And anyone who questions the policy is a climate change denier who wants to take all this money that we're giving you away from you. It certainly is a helpful, snappy message that will work on people who aren't paying attention to the details. But listen, ultimately, I think it comes down to this. Our politics have veered too far into the realm of absolutism and activism, rather than recognizing the delicate compromises that need to be made between these different issues. Should we sacrifice Canada's economic well-being by attacking any business or sector that has any negative impact on the environment? Well, of course not. But at the same exact time, should we decimate Canada's environment, the trees, the mountains, the lakes that make up Canada's gorgeous natural landscapes, all in search of an ever-increasing profit margin? Well, also, of course not, right? Life, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, isn't a matter of absolutes in my experience thus far. It's a matter of compromises in murky gray areas in a lot of different categories. We might disagree on where exactly on the scale we should be, and in fact, I think we should disagree and be able to disagree. I think that's a good thing. It's a benefit of a democracy, and it means we're talking about something that matters. But we should be able to have those conversations united as Canadians for the benefit of Canada without making judgments about the character of the people that we disagree with. But unfortunately, all I see these days from both conservatives and from liberals is a focus on dividing and polarizing Canadians for political gain, while paying lip service to the issues, to whatever issues Canadians care about based on the most recent polling, and theatrically performing in whatever way you think will get you the most votes without much care about actually solving the issues. After all, these are long-term issues and you'll be out of office by the time anything actually matters. Maybe I'm getting too cynical, but it's how I feel based on what I'm seeing these days. And I'm curious what you think about all of this. What have I gotten wrong here in my analysis? What have I gotten right? Let me know in the comments. I'm just trying to figure this out based on what I'm seeing, just like all of you are. So let me know what you think. And also, hey, if you're watching these videos, you probably recognize that background looks a little bit different. Actually, in the process of a move right now, so in the not too distant future, you'll be seeing a different background pretty soon. So that's exciting too. But I appreciate you watching this video. I hope it helped you out at least a little bit. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you next time.